That iconic red Cartier box sits on your vanity, its golden embossed lettering catching the light as you lift the lid. And there it is, a piece of jewelry so perfect, so impossibly refined, that for a moment you forget everything else in the room. The weight of it in your hand, the way it catches light from 3 directions simultaneously, the quiet, absolute certainty that you are holding something that was made for people who do not need to ask the price. This is the Cartier experience. This is what 3 brothers from Paris built across 6 decades of hunger and genius and calculated audacity. They divided the world like generals. They dressed empresses and maharajas and movie stars. They sold a pearl necklace and received a Manhattan mansion in return. They created pieces so magnificent that owning them meant joining a club where ordinary millionaires didn't qualify for membership, and then their grandchildren sold it all for a fraction of what it was worth. Without a fight. The story of how the Cartier family built one of the greatest luxury empires in human history, and then quietly, almost politely, handed it to strangers, is one of the most dramatic and instructive sagas in the entire history of fashion and luxury. It is a story about hunger and comfort, about obsession and indifference, about the specific cruelty of inherited wealth, and about what happens when the generation that built something extraordinary produces children who never had to want for anything at all. This is the Cartier family. This is how they built a $4 billion empire, and this is how they lost it. The metalworker's son who dreamed differently. Paris in 1819 was a city of rigid hierarchies and almost no exceptions. Being born poor meant staying poor, and the children of working men did not generally grow up to dress the empresses of Europe. Dreams of a different life were considered not merely impractical, but slightly embarrassing. The province of fools and fantasists who hadn't yet learned that the world did not rearrange itself for the convenience of people without money. Louis-François Cartier was born into this Paris. His father worked as a metal craftsman, hands stained dark every evening, coming home with the specific exhaustion of a man who makes beautiful things for other people and goes home to nothing beautiful at all. His mother worked as a laundress, scrubbing the expensive fabrics of rich women, while her own family made do with clothes that had been mended so many times they were more patched than original material. They lived in the kind of apartment that smelled like factory smoke and cold stone, where every meal required calculation and every winter was a test of survival. But Louis-François Cartier was watching. He had always been watching. While other children played in the streets of his quarter, he studied how light moved through glass, how metal could be worked into forms that made people stop walking and simply stare. He noticed things. He remembered them. He filed them away with the intense, patient attention of someone who is not simply admiring beauty, but trying to understand its mechanism, trying to reverse engineer the specific quality of a thing that makes people want it so badly they will pay almost anything to have it. His apprenticeship under Adolphe Picard changed everything. Picard's workshop on the Rue Montorgueil was not a pleasant place to learn a trade. It was demanding, physically grueling, and absolutely unforgiving of imprecision. Apprentices worked until their hands bled and began again the following morning. The standard was not good. The standard was not excellent. The standard was perfect or it was not acceptable, and Picard had no vocabulary for anything in between. Other apprentices counted the days until they could leave. Louis-François Cartier counted what he was learning. Picard saw something in him. Not just skill. Skill was common enough in that workshop, the whole point of the apprenticeship system being to produce skill in quantity. What Picard saw in Louis-François was a different quality of attention, a hunger that went beyond wanting to make nice things into actually understanding what made things powerful. What made someone stop at a window display? What made a woman touch a necklace with the specific yearning of someone who has already, in some private part of herself, decided she will own it? Louis-François Cartier didn't just want to learn jewelry. He wanted to learn desire itself. By 1847, the apprenticeship was complete, and the moment of decision had arrived. Picard was offering to sell him the workshop. The price was everything Louis-François had saved through years of disciplined, monk-like self-denial. Years of refusing the small pleasures that his peers allowed themselves. Years of living at the margin so that the margin could become something more. This was not a business decision. It was a bet on himself, placed with everything he had, with no safety net and no fallback position. If it worked, he would have a foundation. If it didn't, there was nothing left. He took the bet. Building the platform for greatness. Louis-François Cartier understood something that most craftsmen of his era did not, that in Paris, location was not merely a convenience. Location was a statement. Where you set up your workshop told people who you were serving and who you intended to serve. And Louis-François Cartier, from the very beginning, intended to serve the most powerful people in France. In 1853, he moved to the Place du Palais Royal, getting physically closer to where the money lived. This was not accidental. Every decision Louis-François made about where to operate was a calculation about proximity to power, about putting himself in the path of the people, whose patronage could transform a craftsman's business into something larger than a craftsman could normally reach. By 1859, he had opened a boutique on the Boulevard des Italiens during Napoleon III's reign, positioned precisely where the emperor's circle shopped, saw, and spent. The game-changing moment came in 1856. Princess Mathilde, the emperor's own cousin, brought him a broken necklace. Other jewelers had looked at it and declared it unfixable. They were wrong. Or rather, they weren't technically wrong. The repair was extraordinarily difficult, the kind of work that required a combination of technical mastery and creative problem-solving that most craftsmen simply didn't possess. Louis-François Cartier possessed it. He treated that necklace with the focused intensity of a man who understood that this single piece of broken jewelry was either his ladder or his wall. When Princess Mathilde told her friends, and in aristocratic circles everything was told to friends, the social network being both the primary entertainment and the primary information system of the era, the impact was immediate. Cartier's name began moving through circles that had never previously admitted a craftsman's son. Commissions arrived from empresses and duchesses who would not previously have spoken to a man of his background under any social circumstances. The barrier had cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked. In 1874, Louis-François handed the business to his son Alfred. What he passed down was not merely a profitable jewelry workshop. He passed down a platform, a name that had been established with precision and patience over 3 decades of impeccable work and strategic positioning, a reputation that was not merely good, but specifically, demonstrably trustworthy among the most demanding and connected clientele in Europe. He had built the foundation. What Alfred would build on it would eventually support an empire. Alfred Cartier was not the visionary that his father had been, nor the global conquistadors that his own sons would become. But he was an excellent custodian of what had been built, and he was wise enough to recognize what his 3 sons were and what they were capable of. He raised Louis, Pierre, and Jacques with the specific combination of ambition and preparation that the next stage of the Cartier story would require. He gave them the platform their grandfather had built and the freedom to use it as aggressively as their natures demanded. And their natures, it turned out, demanded a great deal. 3 brothers, 3 continents, 1 impossible ambition. They sat around a world map, according to family stories preserved by their descendant Francesca Cartier-Brickell, and divided the planet like generals planning a campaign. Not like children playing at empire, like actual strategists who had assessed the territory, identified the opportunities, and made the cold-blooded determination that the world's greatest concentrations of wealth were accessible, if you went at them correctly, from 3 specific positions. Louis would take Europe from Paris. Pierre would conquer America. Jacques would command the British Empire from London. The agreement sounded like hubris. It turned out to be genius. Louis Cartier was born in 1875 with what his contemporaries described as an artist's imagination and a businessman's ruthlessness, a combination that is rare enough in either field to be extraordinary when they appear together in a single person. He had the ability to conceive of jewelry designs that were genuinely new, not variations on existing forms, but actual departures from the visual vocabulary of the time. and the commercial intelligence to understand which of those departures would create desire and which would merely create confusion. His headquarters on the Rue de la Paix, established in 1899, became something more than a jewelry store. It became a destination, a pilgrimage site for European aristocrats, for the new fortunes of the Gilded Age, for anyone who wanted to signal with the specific precision that luxury goods signal such things, that they operated at a level of wealth and taste that most people could not approach. The address itself became a credential. Louis's technical innovations were transformative. He was among the first jewelers to fully understand and exploit the properties of platinum, a metal that allowed constructions of extraordinary delicacy because of its strength, enabling settings so fine they appeared to be made of light rather than metal. Before platinum, the primary luxury metals were gold and silver, both of which imposed structural constraints that limited the forms a jeweler could achieve. Platinum removed those constraints. Louis Cartier used the removal to create the garland style, an aesthetic of extraordinary lightness, of jewelry that appeared to float on the skin rather than sit upon it. The tank watch, introduced in 1917 and inspired by the aerial view of the Renault tanks on the Western Front during the First World War, became something no watch had quite been before. It was not merely a timekeeping instrument. It was a status object, a design statement, a signal that the person wearing it had the specific quality of taste that recognized and valued restraint over ostentation. Royalty wore it, politicians wore it, artists and intellectuals wore it. The tank watch created a category of its own, the essential possession of anyone who wanted to communicate that they were serious. The mystery clocks were something else entirely. Clockwork mechanisms enclosed in crystal cases, the hands appearing to float without any visible support or mechanism, telling time through what seemed, to anyone who looked at them without understanding the engineering, like pure magic. They were conversation pieces, intellectual showpieces, objects that combined Louis Cartier's visual imagination with the highest technical craftsmanship available in early 20th century Europe. Competitors studied them and could not replicate the effect. They remain, a century later, among the most sought-after objects in the history of decorative arts. Pierre and the American Conquest. Pierre Cartier arrived in America in 1909 with the instincts of a man who understood his target market with unusual precision. America in 1909 was a country of new money, industrial fortunes assembled in a generation, wealth so massive and so recently acquired that its owners were still working out what it meant, what it entitled them to, what it obligated them to display. European aristocracy understood its position through centuries of inherited custom and expectation. American wealth was working things out in real time, and it was working them out in public. Pierre understood immediately that American wealthy society operated by different rules than European aristocracy, and that those different rules created opportunities that the Cartier approach could exploit. Americans didn't need a family history to validate their status. They needed objects, visible, unambiguous, magnificent objects that communicated the scale of their achievement to anyone who looked. And they needed those objects to be endorsed by precisely the kind of European aristocratic legitimacy that their own newness prevented them from claiming for themselves. Cartier offered both. The objects were extraordinary. The legitimacy was impeccable. Royal warrants, empress clients, the endorsement of every crowned head in Europe. Pierre Cartier walked into New York's drawing rooms carrying the combined weight of 100 years of European prestige and a current client list that included half the royalty on the continent. He was received with exactly the enthusiasm that implies. The masterpiece of Pierre's American career was the transaction that secured the Cartier Fifth Avenue location. He was offered a pearl necklace of extraordinary quality, 2 strands of perfect natural pearls at a moment when the pearl market was at its absolute peak, before cultured pearls had entered the market and disrupted the value of natural ones forever. He accepted the necklace. What he offered in exchange was a 6-story mansion on Fifth Avenue belonging to Morton F. Plant. The property was assessed at approximately $920,000 against the necklace's $1 million valuation. By any conventional accounting, it was a remarkably balanced trade for the time. But Pierre Cartier understood something that conventional accounting doesn't capture. A pearl necklace depreciates when its owner wears it, or rather, it belongs to its owner, moves with its owner, disappears into private life. A Fifth Avenue mansion is permanent. It commands one of the most visible addresses in America. It is itself a statement. And for Cartier to occupy that address, to have the Cartier name above the door on Fifth Avenue, was worth more than any pearl necklace in terms of what it communicated about the house's position in American luxury life. He had traded a beautiful object for a permanent declaration of presence. He had traded magnificently. The Hope Diamond episode demonstrated Pierre's marketing genius in perhaps its purest form. The Hope Diamond was one of the most famous gems in the world. Pierre Cartier bought it, but found it difficult to sell. He knew exactly what he was doing. To close the sale, he leaned into and essentially helped create the modern mythology of the cursed diamond. He then sold it to Evelyn Walsh McLean, a socialite who was precisely the kind of client for whom a famous cursed diamond was irresistible, a woman who wore it to dinner parties and laughed about the curse and was photographed wearing it at every opportunity. The diamond, the publicity, the Cartier name attached to both. Pierre Cartier understood that controversy directed at an object of beauty and value is not damage, it is amplification. Jacques and the Jewels of the East. If Louis was the artist and Pierre was the strategist, Jacques Cartier was the adventurer. And his adventures were the kind that other jewelers, sitting safely in their Paris and London workshops, could only dream about. Jacques opened the London operation in 1902, timing the establishment with a precision that was characteristic of the family's approach to everything. King Edward VII's coronation that year was the most significant ceremonial occasion in Britain in decades, and the demand for jewelry, tiaras, brooches, necklaces, the full apparatus of aristocratic display that a coronation required, was enormous and immediate. The Cartier London workshop produced 27 tiaras for King Edward's coronation. 27. Each one a masterwork of the specific kind that royal ceremony demands, formal enough to be appropriate, magnificent enough to be memorable, technically accomplished enough to survive the scrutiny of the most knowledgeable eyes in Europe. King Edward VII himself, a man who understood luxury with the confidence of someone who had been surrounded by it since birth, gave Cartier an official royal warrant in 1904. The phrase he reportedly used, "the jeweler of kings and the king of jewelers," became one of the most valuable pieces of marketing language in the history of luxury. Not because Cartier needed the promotion, but because the phrase captured something true and made it portable. Every aristocratic European court that followed Britain's lead, Spain, Portugal, Serbia, Russia, and eventually France itself, granted their own royal warrants, each one adding another layer of legitimacy to a reputation that was already more than solid. But it was Jacques' expeditions to India that produced the most distinctive and enduring contribution to the Cartier aesthetic. He traveled to meet Maharajas in their palaces, charming his way into treasure rooms that contained gemstones accumulated over centuries, rubies and emeralds of a size and quality that the European market had rarely encountered, colored stones of a vivid intensity that European jewelry had not yet fully learned to use. These expeditions were not comfortable or safe. They required the specific combination of physical courage, social charisma, and commercial intelligence that Jacques possessed in unusual measure. What he brought back inspired the Tutti Frutti collection, the pieces that combined large carved colored stones, emeralds and rubies, and sapphires and carved leaves and fruits and flowers, in settings that expressed the visual vocabulary of Mughal jewelry while making it accessible to European and American clients. The pieces were extraordinary. They were also, by any measure, genuinely new. A synthesis of Eastern and Western aesthetic traditions that had not previously been achieved at the level of quality and originality that Cartier achieved it. Fashion and jewelry historians still regard the Tutti Frutti collection as one of the most significant creative achievements in the history of 20th century jewelry design. The Patiala necklace, commissioned in 1925 by the Maharaj of Patiala, represented the apex of this Indo-European creative dialogue. The Maharaj arrived in Paris with a collection of unset gemstones of almost incomprehensible quantity and quality, and commissioned from Cartier a necklace that would set them to their best advantage. The result, requiring weeks of work by Cartier's finest craftsmen, was a 5-strand choker incorporating 2,930 diamonds, including the De Beers yellow diamond of 234.6 carats as its centerpiece, surrounded by rubies and other precious stones in settings that represented the absolute summit of what early 20th century jewelry craft could achieve. It was valued at the equivalent of approximately $2.5 billion in today's money. It was worn once, at a formal reception in Paris, and then it disappeared from public knowledge for most of the 20th century, eventually re-emerging, without most of its original gemstones, stripped and dispersed by unknown hands, in London in 1998. The loss of the Patiala necklace is its own tragedy. But Jacques Cartier's creation of it is a monument to what the three brothers at their peak were capable of producing. The machinery of magnificence. What the three brothers created was not merely a jewelry business. It was a complete system, an interconnected apparatus of design, craft, client relations, marketing, and strategic positioning that operated at a level of coordination unusual even for well-run family enterprises of the era. The workshops that produced Cartier jewelry in the early 20th century were places of extraordinary, demanding craft. Techniques that had been developed and refined over generations were practiced by craftsmen who spent careers mastering single aspects of the jewelry-making process. Setters who spent decades learning to place stones with microscopic precision, engravers who could work at scales invisible to the naked eye, polishers who understood how to bring out the specific quality of light that differentiated a magnificent piece from merely a very expensive one. The mystery setting, patented in 1933, made precious stones appear to float in mid-air without visible supports. This required engineering of a kind that most jewelers could not achieve. The stones are specially grooved and slid onto a series of tiny T-shaped gold rails, entirely concealed within the piece's framework, allowing them to sit without prongs or bezels or any of the visible means by which stones are normally secured. The effect, when it works, is genuinely uncanny. Gems suspended in nothing, held by physics and engineering that the viewer cannot locate. Louis Cartier was obsessive about this kind of technical achievement. He understood that the mystery setting and the mystery clocks and the platinum garland pieces were not merely beautiful. They were demonstrations of capability, proof that Cartier could do things that other houses could not. And that proof was itself a form of marketing, more powerful than any advertisement because it was experienced rather than claimed. The client relationships the brothers cultivated were not transactional. They were something closer to friendships conducted through extraordinary objects, relationships in which the client trusted Cartier to understand what they needed, and Cartier understood that the client's loyalty was worth more than any single commission. When the Russian Revolution destroyed the family's aristocratic Russian clientele overnight, the brothers pivoted to American millionaires without losing a year of business. When the Great Depression reduced the American market, they shifted focus to Indian Maharajas and the oil-rich Gulf clients who were emerging as a significant new source of luxury demand. Their flexibility was the flexibility of people who understood their business at the deepest level, who knew that their product was not jewelry but desire itself, and that desire could always find a new population of people who had the means to satisfy it. The royal warrants from multiple European courts were, in retrospect, the apex of the original Cartier model. By 1910, the house held warrants from Britain, Spain, Portugal, Serbia, and Russia, and had documented relationships with the courts of virtually every remaining European monarchy. The Cartier name had achieved a specific kind of legitimacy that money alone cannot buy, the legitimacy of aristocratic endorsement, of being the chosen supplier to people whose own status was beyond question. When you wore Cartier, you were wearing what queens wore. That association was worth more than any single piece of jewelry. The empire at its height. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Cartier empire was at its full, extraordinary extent. The Paris flagship on the Rue de la Paix was the most prestigious jewelry destination in Europe. The New York store on Fifth Avenue was the defining luxury destination of the American market. The London operation supplied the British royal family and the aristocratic establishment that still, in the years before the Second World War, set the cultural standard for what distinguished taste looked like. The client list reads like a roll call of the 20th century's most powerful and celebrated people. Princess Mathilde and Empress Eugénie in Paris, King Edward VII and the British royal family in London, the Maharajas of Patiala, Capurthala and Baroda, bringing their extraordinary Indian gemstones and commissioning pieces that combined Eastern and Western jewelry traditions in ways the world had not previously seen. The Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, and the Astors in New York, using Cartier to signal the specific quality of their wealth. Grace Kelly, receiving the magnificent emerald pieces from Prince Rainier on the occasion of their engagement. Elizabeth Taylor, whose appetite for extraordinary gemstones found its perfect supplier in a house that had access to the world's finest stones and the craft to set them magnificently. The Duke of Windsor and Wallis Simpson were clients whose patronage said something interesting about the Cartier approach to celebrity and controversy. The Duke had abdicated the British throne for Wallis Simpson in 1936 in one of the great romantic scandals of the century. They were controversial, yet Cartier served them anyway. The pragmatism was characteristic. The Duke and Duchess had money, they had taste, and they had the specific combination of celebrity and social standing that made their patronage visible and valuable. It was for Wallis that Cartier created the iconic Panthère brooch in 1948, a golden cat flecked with black enamel, crouching on a 116-carat emerald cabochon. The Art Deco period, which dominated the 1920s and into the 1930s, was one in which Cartier's visual language was particularly well matched to the cultural moment. The geometric precision, the dramatic contrast of white and black and vivid color, the combination of precious and semi-precious materials in single pieces, the interest in Egyptian and Asian motifs following the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, all of these were directions in which Louis Cartier's design sensibility naturally moved, and all of them produced pieces that remain among the most sought after at auction today. The mystery clocks of this period are astonishing objects. Crystal cases enclosing mechanisms concealed so completely that the clocks appear to operate by supernatural means. Panthers made from black enamel and diamonds, cigarette cases in geometric patterns of onyx and coral and jade. Brooches of such technical refinement that examining them under magnification reveals construction details that were never intended to be seen, details that were executed with the same precision as the visible elements purely because the craftsmen who made them accepted nothing less from themselves. This was the empire in its full expression. 3 brothers, 3 continents, one perfectly coordinated system of beauty and desire and extraordinary craft. It was, by any measure, one of the great achievements of 20th century luxury, and it was about to begin its long, quiet collapse. The first deaths and the wobbling stool. The obituaries came close together and the impact was devastating in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. Jacques Cartier died in September 1941 at 57. The world was at war. Supply chains were disrupted. Wealthy clients were in circumstances that made the purchase of extraordinary jewelry difficult to prioritize. The business that Jacques had built through decades of personal relationships now had to operate without the irreplaceable combination of his specific personal gifts. Louis Cartier followed him just months later, in July 1942. He was 67. The double loss was not merely the loss of 2 men, but the loss of the creative and managerial framework that had made the whole enterprise work. The company had been designed around the specific abilities of 3 specific people: Louis's artistic vision, Pierre's commercial aggression, Jacques' adventurous sourcing and personal charisma. Remove 2 of the 3 legs, and the structure that remains can still stand, but it cannot bear the weight it was designed to carry. Pierre Cartier was left alone, attempting to manage global operations during a world war with bombs falling and governments collapsing and the entire social and economic order being systematically dismantled. He managed. The business survived the war in a state of reduced operations. But it survived. When the war ended and the luxury market began its slow recovery, there was still a Cartier to participate in that recovery. Pierre had held the institution together through extraordinary circumstances. But Pierre's death in 1964 removed the last of the founding generation's direct custodians. And what remained after his death was a business without anyone at its head who understood the specific nature of what they were running, or who cared about it with anything approaching the intensity that the founders had brought to every aspect of its creation. The fourth generation and the failure of hunger. The problem with inheriting an empire is that you receive the result without the process. You get the mansion without the memory of the apartment that smelled like factory smoke. You get the Fifth Avenue address without the memory of what it cost to secure it. You get the client list of Maharajas and movie stars without any recollection of the broken necklace that Princess Mathilde brought to a struggling craftsman in 1856, and of what it meant to him when he fixed it perfectly and she told her friends. The fourth generation of the Cartier family received one of the greatest luxury businesses in the world. What they did not receive, what cannot be transmitted through inheritance, through education, through any mechanism that wealth has at its disposal, was the hunger that had created it. The obsessive, consuming, all-setting hunger of Louis-François Cartier, watching light move through glass in a working-class Paris neighborhood, understanding beauty as a weapon, and determining to master that weapon, no matter what it cost him. Francesca Cartier-Britell, whose research into the family archive would eventually produce the definitive account of the family's history, describes the fourth generation with a sympathy that does not soften the assessment. They had grown up wealthy, they had been educated at the finest institutions, they had married intelligently and invested prudently. They were, by most measures, successful people. What they were not was the kind of obsessive, work-consumed, sacrifice-embracing individuals that the running of a global luxury empire at the level the brothers had established required. They preferred, Britell has written with gentle candor, the social pleasures that their position afforded them. The winters in St. Moritz, the summer estates, the world of inherited comfort that the brothers had created and that now, in the second and third generation of enjoyment, had become simply the world as it naturally was, requiring no particular gratitude and certainly no sacrifice. The business of managing Cartier was demanding and unglamorous in the specific ways that all business is demanding and unglamorous at close range. It required daily attention to operational details, the management of workshops and craftsmen, the cultivation of client relationships, the navigation of supply chains for precious stones. The brothers had done all of this with the intensity of people whose entire sense of themselves was invested in the outcome. The fourth generation viewed it as work with the limited enthusiasm that work commands from people who have alternatives. Geographic distance compounded the problem. The three branches, Paris, London, New York, had functioned as a unified whole under the brothers. Without that shared vision, the branches began to operate as separate entities, each following local business practices and local priorities, creating the inefficiency and occasional contradiction that follows when a system designed around personal coordination is run instead by institutional process. And the luxury market itself was changing. The scale of investment required to compete in the global luxury environment of the 1960s and 1970s was beyond what a family enterprise could easily sustain. Professional management, with access to capital markets and modern operational expertise, was becoming necessary. The family faced a choice: adapt to a new business environment or find a way to exit that preserved some value from what had been built. They chose to exit, the selling off of a century. Claude Cartier fired the first shot in 1962 when he sold the New York operations before Pierre had even died. The decision was received within the family with a mixture of shock and recognition. Shock at the act itself, at the willingness to dispose of something that had been built with such difficulty. Recognition that it had perhaps been inevitable, that Claude had never had the drive or the obsession that the story required. Marion Cartier Claudel and Jean-Jacques Cartier found themselves attempting to manage pieces of an empire that no longer worked together. The cousins disagreed about direction and strategy. Their inability to reconcile those differences made any coherent strategic response to the competitive pressures they faced essentially impossible. Jean-Jacques Cartier understood what was being lost. By accounts of people who knew him, he was not indifferent to the heritage he had inherited. He understood that selling represented the end of something irreplaceable. But the practical realities of running a fragmented global luxury business had become too complex for a divided family that lacked both the unified vision and the specific expertise that the situation required. The Paris headquarters was sold in 1972. Robert Hawke and Joseph Canouille led the group of investors that purchased it. London followed in 1974. The final piece, the New York branch, was reunited with the others in 1976 when the same investor group completed the consolidation. By 1979, all three branches had been brought together under a new entity called Cartier Monde, but the founding family was entirely gone. After 132 years of family heritage, the metalworker's son's empire belonged to someone else. The irony was as brutal as any in the history of business. The family had built something extraordinary through sacrifice and obsession. They had created an institution so powerful that its name alone was worth billions. And when the moment came to defend that institution, they discovered that the capacity for sacrifice had not been inherited. They had the mansion. They had forgotten how to do what it took to keep it. What the professionals built on what the family left. Under professional management, first Robert Hawke and his partners, then increasingly under the umbrella of the Richemont Group, the Swiss luxury conglomerate that eventually became the parent company, Cartier became more successful than it had been at almost any point during family ownership. This fact is worth sitting with because it carries implications that complicate any simple narrative of decline. The Richemont Group brought to Cartier what the fourth generation of the founding family had lacked: capital, operational expertise, modern marketing capabilities, and the organizational structure to manage a genuinely global luxury business. Under professional management, the number of Cartier stores grew from a handful to over 200 worldwide. Annual revenue grew to over $6 billion. The brand is consistently ranked among the most valuable in the world, a number that would have been entirely beyond the imagination of Louis-François Cartier standing in Picard's workshop in the 1840s. The red box, the gold lettering, the love bracelet, the tank watch, the Trinity ring, these objects and their associations have been maintained and in many cases amplified under corporate ownership. Corporate ownership provided the capital for the kind of global marketing campaigns, the high-profile partnerships and sponsorships, the opening of flagship stores in every major luxury market that maintaining a contemporary global luxury brand requires. The paradox is this: the Cartier brand survived the loss of the Cartier family not just intact but enhanced. The entity that carries the name has never been more financially successful. The red box sits on more vanities in more countries than Louis-François Cartier could have dreamed of when he first apprenticed himself to Picard's workshop. By the metrics that most businesses use to measure their success, the story of Cartier is not a story of failure at all. But Francesca Cartier-Bréchot tells it differently. She tells it as a story about what gets lost when the specific human qualities that built something extraordinary are not transmitted. About how hunger cannot be passed down the way property can. About how the obsession of a metal worker's son who watched light move through glass cannot be recreated by grandchildren who grew up with every advantage that son's obsession purchased for them. The letters in that trunk documented not the business transactions, but the personal relationships between three brothers who divided a world map and meant every word of it, between Jacques Cartier and the Maharajas who showed him treasures in rooms that other jewelers would never enter, between Louis Cartier and the craftsmen he drove toward a perfection that bordered on the impossible. The story the letters told was about what extraordinary things require from the people who build them, and about how rarely those requirements are transmitted from one generation to the next. The woman who remembered. There is still a Cartier in the story. Just one. Francesca Cartier-Brickell is the great-granddaughter of Louis Cartier, and she occupies a unique position in the Cartier narrative. She discovered the trunk of family letters in Jean-Jacques Cartier's wine cellar. She spent years researching the archives. She produced a book, The Cartiers, that is considered the definitive account of how the family built and then lost their empire. She maintains a connection to the Richemont Group through her work as a historian of the family's legacy, representing the last remaining link between the bloodline and the institution that still carries their name. Her relationship to the story is worth considering. She did not sell what her relatives built. What she has done instead is remember. She has insisted on the importance of the history, not the financial history, but the human history. The brother who charmed his way into Maharaja's treasure rooms, the one who traded a pearl necklace for a Manhattan mansion, the one who invented mystery clocks that appeared to operate by magic, the apprentice who watched light move through glass and decided he would master beauty or die trying. Her book is not, in the end, a business history. It is an act of preservation. She cannot give the red box back to her family, but she can make sure that what the red box represents, the hunger and the genius and the obsession and the sacrifice that created it, is not forgotten, along with the fortune. The Cartier name sits on a Fifth Avenue building that Pierre Cartier secured through one of the most audacious deals in the history of luxury retail. It sits above workshops where craftsmen still practice techniques that Louis Cartier refined and championed. It is printed on red boxes that arrive on vanities in 200 countries. Inside those boxes are objects made with extraordinary skill, bearing a name that means what it means because of three brothers who divided a world map and kept their promise. And in the wine cellar of an old house in France, there was once a trunk of letters, and in those letters the full story of what it took to put that name on those boxes and what it cost to lose it. The lessons written in red and gold. What does the Cartier story teach us? It teaches several things, and none of them are simple. It teaches that the qualities required to build something extraordinary, the hunger, the obsession, capacity for the kind of sustained effort that feels less like work and more like necessity, are not heritable properties. They are forged in specific circumstances, by specific pressures, in specific people. Louis-François Cartier's hunger was produced by a cold apartment and the absolute clarity of someone who knows exactly what poverty feels like. That hunger cannot be passed down with the estate. It teaches that the greatest threat to a dynasty is frequently not external competition, but internal indifference. The Cartier family was not destroyed by a competitor or by a shift in consumer taste. They were undone by comfort, by the specific luxury of not caring enough about something to sacrifice for it, by grandchildren who had grown up in the house that hunger built and who found the house pleasant enough, but the hunger incomprehensible. It teaches that sometimes the institution outlives the family in ways that are commercially triumphant and humanly ambiguous. Cartier under Richemont is more profitable and more globally present than Cartier under the founding family ever was. By the metrics of the business world, professional management improved on what the family had built. By the metrics of the human story, of what it means for three brothers to have divided a world map, something was lost when the last Cartier's name came off the ownership documents. And it teaches, perhaps most importantly, that objects carry stories that outlast the people who made them. The red Cartier box on your vanity carries within it the specific history of a metalworker's son who watched light move through glass. It carries the memory of three brothers sitting around a map of the world and making an agreement that most people would have called impossible. It carries the ghost of Jacques Cartier in an Indian palace, of Louis Cartier bent over a platinum setting, of Pierre Cartier sliding a pearl necklace across a negotiating table. Those stories are in the box. They are in the piece inside the box. They are in the name on the lid, the gold lettering catching the light, the specific weight of the thing when you lift it. Sometimes the greatest things we build outlast our right to own them. Sometimes what we create grows larger than we can contain. Sometimes the empire survives the dynasty, and the dynasty survives in the story, and the story survives in the object, and the object survives in the light that catches the gold lettering of a red box on a vanity somewhere in the world, every 30 seconds of every day. That is the Cartier family. That is what they built, and that, in the end, is how they live on. The mystery setting, engineering the impossible. There is a specific moment that every Cartier client who has ever examined a mystery set piece describes the same way. You look at the stone, you look at the mounting, you look again at where the stone should connect to its support, and there is nothing there, no prong, no bezel, no visible means by which the stone is being held in space. It appears to be floating, suspended in the piece by nothing at all, except possibly the specific desire of whoever made it. This is the mystery setting, and it is one of the most technically demanding achievements in the history of jewelry craft. Understanding why it matters, why Louis Cartier invested the resources and the years of development that producing it reliably required, tells you something fundamental about the Cartier philosophy and about why the brothers succeeded where so many others who attempted to compete in the same market failed. The mystery setting works through an internal mechanism entirely concealed within the piece's frame. The stones are specially grooved and slid onto a series of tiny T-shaped gold or platinum rails. This system allows the stones to sit without prongs or bezels or any of the visible means by which stones are normally secured. The engineering required to achieve this consistently, in a variety of stone shapes and sizes, across thousands of individual pieces, is genuinely remarkable. But the engineering is not, finally, what makes the mystery setting matter. What makes it matter is what it communicates. It communicates mastery, the absolute mastery that can achieve things which appear, to the uninitiated eye, to defy the normal laws governing how materials behave. It says, we can do things that other people cannot do. We can make the impossible look effortless. Louis Cartier understood that in the luxury market, the ultimate credential is not the price of the materials. Rubies and emeralds and diamonds are available to any house with sufficient capital. The ultimate credential is what you can do with those materials that no one else can do. The mystery setting was his clearest statement of that credential. You either could or you couldn't, and Cartier could. The mystery clocks extended the same philosophy into a different medium. Crystal cases, visible mechanisms replaced by invisible ones. Hands that appeared to float to tell time by magic, their motion unconnected by any visible means to any visible source of energy. Engineers who examined them and left without fully understanding how they worked. Singularity in the luxury world is the ultimate luxury. The royal warrants and what they actually meant. When King Edward VII granted Cartier its first British royal warrant in 1904 and described the house as the jeweler of kings and the king of jewelers, he was providing a form of endorsement whose value in the luxury market of the early 20th century was essentially incalculable. Royal warrants were not decorative distinctions. They were functional credentials. They told anyone who saw them, in the right social circles, that the item bearing the warrant had been judged by people whose own status was beyond question as meeting a standard worth formal acknowledgement. The warrant was not a claim about quality. It was a statement about belonging. Belonging mattered enormously in the social world that Cartier was navigating in the first decades of the 20th century. The aristocratic and royal courts of Europe operated on a system of interlocking legitimacies. It was, in essence, a system of certified prestige, and the royal warrant was one of the most powerful certifications available. When other European courts followed Britain's lead, Spain, Portugal, Serbia, Russia, each additional warrant added another layer of certification to a reputation that was already more than solid. By 1910, Cartier could claim the endorsement of virtually every surviving European monarchy. The combined weight of those endorsements told the global luxury market that Cartier was not merely very good. It was the standard by which goodness in this field was measured. The American clients, The Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Astors were, in their own way, even more important beneficiaries of the royal warrant system. These were people who had more money than most European aristocrats, but who lacked the centuries of accumulated social legitimacy. They needed credentials they could not inherit. The Cartier royal warrants were exactly such a credential, an endorsement from the people whose own legitimacy was ancient and unquestionable. Pierre Cartier understood this with the clarity of someone who had made a specific study of his market. His American clients were not buying jewelry, they were buying certification, the formal, visible acknowledgement that they operated at a level where European royal endorsement was the relevant standard, and that they met it. The pearl necklace, the Fifth Avenue mansion. Each element of Pierre's American strategy was oriented around the same fundamental insight, that in a society that was still working out its own hierarchies, the ability to claim the endorsement of older and more established hierarchies was worth more than the objects themselves. The warrants were the foundation of that claim, and the brothers earned them honestly. The Tutti Frutti legacy. Of all the design innovations that the three brothers introduced during their leadership of Cartier, none has proved more enduring as a collector's category or more historically interesting as a cultural artifact than the Tutti Frutti collection. The pieces emerged directly from Jacques Cartier's Indian expeditions, his ability to enter treasure rooms, and his observation of the Mughal jewelry tradition. Mughal jewelry used carved colored stones, not polished cabochons, not faceted gems in Western cuts, but stones carved into leaves and flowers and fruit. The tradition was ancient, technically demanding, and almost completely unknown in the European and American luxury markets. Jacques brought carved emeralds back from India, rubies shaped like berries, sapphires cut into leaves, and he and Louis together worked out how to incorporate these extraordinary materials into pieces that captured the visual richness and exotic beauty of the Mughal tradition, while presenting it through Cartier's platinum settings and Art Deco sensibility. The result was the Tutti Frutti style, named for the profusion of colored carved stones that characterized the pieces. Arranged in designs that combined Indian motifs with the geometric precision of the Art Deco period. Bracelets of carved emerald leaves and ruby berries and sapphire flowers, set in platinum bands of extraordinary delicacy. Necklaces that combined Western construction with Eastern materials in proportions that made the combination feel inevitable. The response was immediate and extraordinary. Wealthy clients who had never considered carved colored stones found in the Tutti Frutti pieces a quality of visual abundance and sensory richness that their previous jewelry had not provided. The pieces felt different in the hand, looked different in the light, and communicated something different from the conventional vocabulary of luxury jewelry at the time. Today, Tutti Frutti pieces consistently achieve record prices at auction. A major Tutti Frutti bracelet sold at Sotheby's in 2020 for $1.34 million. The pieces are not merely valuable, they are historically significant, primary evidence of one specific moment when Eastern and Western jewelry traditions met at Cartier's workbench and produced something that neither tradition alone could have created. That meeting happened because Jacques Cartier got on a boat and sailed to India. It happened because Louis Cartier understood how to set those extraordinary materials, and what it produced is still, a century later, among the most sought-after category of 20th century jewelry by collectors who understand the field. The Patiala Necklace, a story of extraordinary creation and mysterious loss. No single object in Cartier's history carries more drama than the Patiala Necklace, and the drama is not merely the drama of its creation. It is the drama of what happened to it afterward. Bhupinder Singh, the Maharaj of Patiala, arrived in Paris in 1925 as one of the most powerful and wealthy rulers in British India. He was a man of legendary extravagance, even by the standards of the Indian princely states, which were themselves famous for the extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary excess of their ruling families. He traveled with a retinue that occupied several floors of the Ritz Hotel. He brought with him a collection of unset gemstones that represented the accumulated treasury of a ruling house with centuries of wealth behind it. The collection included the De Beers yellow diamond, 234.65 carats, one of the largest and finest yellow diamonds known at the time. It included hundreds of additional diamonds, rubies, and other precious stones. The Maharaja had brought this extraordinary collection to Cartier with a commission. Create a necklace that would set these stones to their best advantage, that would be worthy of the finest state occasions, that would represent the full magnificence of what the House of Patiala possessed. Louis and Jacques Cartier accepted the commission. What followed was weeks of work in the Paris workshops, work of a kind that stretched the capabilities of even Cartier's most expert craftsmen to their limit. The necklace that emerged was a 5-strand platinum chain incorporating 2,930 diamonds in total, with the De Beers diamond as its centerpiece surrounded by emeralds and rubies in settings of extraordinary delicacy. The 5 strands graduated in size from the outer strands to the center, creating a visual depth and dimensionality that complemented the extraordinary quality of the principal stone. The bill was 12,000 francs. The necklace was photographed in the workshops, in the specific documentary style that Cartier used to record exceptional commissions, and the photographs survive in the archive. They show an object of almost impossible magnificence, an object that appears, even in the slightly flat quality of early 20th century photography, to vibrate with the concentrated brilliance of nearly 3,000 diamonds. The Maharaja wore the necklace once, at a formal reception in Paris in the weeks following its completion. It was photographed again, it was admired, and then it returned with him to India, where it entered the vaults of the Patiala treasury. And then it disappeared. When researchers began attempting to trace the necklace in the late 20th century, they found that it had vanished from the historical record sometime after Indian independence in 1947, and the integration of the princely states into the Republic of India, which occurred with varying degrees of cooperation and in some cases active resistance from ruling families who had maintained effectively independent status under British suzerainty. The Patiala treasury, like many treasuries of the former princely states, was not comprehensively documented before or during this transition. Objects disappeared. Some were sold, some were distributed among family members, some were stolen. The record is incomplete. In 1998, a descendant of the Maharaj walked into Cartier's London workshop carrying what appeared to be the frame of the Patiala necklace, the platinum structure, the settings, everything that had held the 2,930 diamonds. The diamonds themselves were gone. The De Beers diamond was gone. The rubies and emeralds were gone. The platinum frame had survived, presumably because platinum was less easily sold than the individual stones it had contained. The craftsmen who examined it confirmed that it was genuine. The original setting, Cartier's own work from 1925, bearing the marks of a specific period and a specific workshop. Cartier undertook a reconstruction, resetting the frame with stones as close as possible to the originals. The reconstructed necklace was eventually exhibited and sold. But the original stones, including the extraordinary De Beers diamond, have not been conclusively located. They may be in private collections. They may have been recut and reset in other pieces, their identity dissolved in new settings. They may have been sold through channels that left no recoverable record. The most magnificent necklace Cartier ever made survived the 20th century as an empty frame. It is, in its way, the perfect emblem of the whole Cartier family story. The frame survived. What it was built to contain is gone. The structure is there. The specific, irreplaceable thing that gave the structure its meaning has dispersed into the world and cannot be recovered. After the red box, what legacy actually means. The Richemont Group has maintained and extended the house's position with considerable skill. The red box is in more places than it has ever been. The love bracelet, introduced in 1969, became one of the most successful single jewelry designs in the history of the industry. The tank watch remains the timepiece that a certain kind of powerful person feels they must own. The brand value continues to grow. All of this is genuine achievement. None of it requires diminishment in order to tell the family's story honestly. The corporate managers who have run Cartier since 1979 have done their jobs well. The craftsmen who work in the Cartier workshops today are extraordinarily skilled practitioners. The objects being produced under the Cartier name in the second decade of the 21st century are being made with care and expertise. But there is a difference between a business and a story. And the story of Cartier, the specific human story, the story of Louis-François watching light through glass, of three brothers around a world map, of Jacques coming back from India with the specific smell of Indian palaces still in his clothes. That story belongs to a family that no longer owns the business. The story is preserved in Francesca Cartier-Brickel's book, in the archive she assembled, in the photographs that show craftsmen and clients and the objects they made together. The red box catches the light. The gold lettering is perfectly legible. The piece inside is exactly what a piece inside a Cartier box should be. And the story that gives the box its meaning lives in a book and in an archive and in the memory of the last Cartier who was paying attention. That is, in the end, what a legacy is. Not the balance sheet, not the Forbes ranking, the story. The specific, irreducible, human story of how something extraordinary was built by people who had everything at stake and gave everything they had. The Cartier family built something the world had never seen before. They gave it to strangers who took good care of it and made it larger. And the one among them who understood what had been lost decided that at least the story would survive. Sometimes the story is the only thing left, and sometimes the story is enough. What the letters in the wine cellar contained, Francesca Cartier-Brickel's book, The Cartiers, is built on a discovery that was almost accidental. Her grandfather Jean-Jacques Cartier, who was the last family member to actually run part of the business, and who had understood better than most of his generation what was being lost when the family decided to sell, had kept the personal correspondence of the founding brothers. Not the business records, those were maintained in the company archives. The personal letters, the ones between three brothers who were living on different continents and running different operations, and who communicated with each other with the specific directness that close siblings use when there is no audience to perform for. In those letters she found the human beings behind the legend. Louis Cartier worrying about a craftsman who had been working on a particularly demanding commission for months and showing signs of the specific exhaustion that the work required. Jacques Cartier describing in vivid sensory detail the specific quality of the light in an Indian palace where he had been shown a collection of extraordinary rubies. Pierre Cartier arguing with the specific irritation of a man who has made a decision and wants agreement he is not receiving about the strategic direction of the American business. She found the arguments, the anxieties, the occasional failures, and the specific pride that the brothers took in the exceptional things they produced. She found the evidence of a family that was beneath the epic scale of what they built, made of the same ordinary materials as everyone else. People who worried about things going wrong, who argued about directions, who felt the weight of what they were carrying, and sometimes wished the weight were lighter. She also found the love letters between her great-grandfather Jacques and his wife Nellie, who had accompanied him on some of the Indian expeditions. These letters, which she quotes in the book with a care that respects their privacy, while allowing readers to understand something of the interior life of one of the three brothers, show a man who was entirely human behind the legendary reputation, who missed his wife when work separated them, who wrote about the beauty of what he was seeing with a directness that was not professional description, but genuine, personal wonder. The trunk of letters was, Brickel has said, the discovery that made the book possible. Not as a source of factual information, though that is also what it was, but as a way of understanding the human reality that the facts described. The Cartier story, as told without those letters, risks becoming a sequence of accomplishments. The platinum garland style, the tank watch, the Patiala necklace, the Fifth Avenue mansion, the royal warrants. With the letters, it becomes something more complicated and more true. The story of three specific people who happened to have the right combination of gifts and circumstances to build something extraordinary, and who were, beneath all of that, simply people. The letters are why the book matters. The letters are why the story matters. Not as a business case study. There are plenty of those, and most of them are less interesting, but as a human story. About what it costs to build something that lasts. About what it means when the people who come after you cannot pay that cost. About the specific, irreducible loneliness of being the generation that understands what is being lost and cannot prevent it. Jean-Jacques Cartier kept those letters in his wine cellar, in boxes, accessible, not quite hidden and not quite displayed. The letters of three brothers who divided a world map and kept their promise. He kept them. And his granddaughter found them. And now the story is told. 3 brothers, 3 continents, 132 years of family heritage, and then a trunk of letters in a wine cellar, and a great-granddaughter who decided that the story deserved to be told in full. The Cartier name still represents something remarkable. The summit of luxury craft, the intersection of extraordinary materials and making, the specific quality of desire that has always been the house's real product. But the family who created that name is gone from the building their grandfather bought with a pearl necklace. They are gone from the workshops their uncle pushed toward impossible standards. What remains is the name, the craft, the red box, the gold letters, the object inside, and the story, which is perhaps the most durable thing of all. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever owned a piece of Cartier jewelry? And if you have, does knowing this history change how you think about it? We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us for another episode, and we'll catch you in the next one. Stay elegant.